Thank you for being here. We're very excited to learn with you tonight. And given that we're approaching Pesach, I mean, we always do this, but we'll have a big chance for questions. We hope the questions on the topic tonight, and of course, many questions not on topic, as we like to ask also. And so before we get to our, well first, let's, I want to call my colleague and friend Rabbi Andy to say a few words about his congregants and friends, Stan and Cheryl.
Delight to be here with all of you, and especially with you, Stan and Cheryl. Shmuley asked me to share. I have a loud voice. Can you hear me? All right. Stan, Cheryl, I'm so grateful to be able to have this moment to just share some love with both of you, because the two of you are phenomenal. You know, we talk about at the Passover Seder about the 4 children, the one that we all want, the wise, and some others. And you are the wisest of the wise, the givingest of the givers, the greatest of the great. And the truth is that what you bring to our congregation with your smiles, with your energy, you know, couple stories. Okay, first, I remember, Cheryl, when the two of us, for that first time we did that service together at Bethel, where Ortzion and Bethel had a service together. And so we're walking around your old stomping grounds, and you show me the picture from when Stan was president of the synagogue a number of years ago. And I look at him and say, he hasn't changed. And you looked at me and said, I know. And Cheryl, you have just stepped up in so many ways to help me, honest to everybody. Cheryl called, and we were in the process of trying to look for an assistant for myself and the other clergy at the synagogue. And she said, you know, Rabbi, while there's not somebody in that role, I have a few hours a week. Can I come and help you out? And I have to tell you, there would be no artwork on the walls of my office. There would be no organization in my office at all. There's so many wonderful conversations that we have because, Cheryl, you dedicate and give your time so generously. And Stan, it happened relatively recently that I got a phone call less than 24 hours before Shabbat that somebody who had been planning to read Torah for us that Shabbat morning was not going to be able to do it. And the first call we made was to Stan Hammerman, who said, it's a lot, but I'm going to learn it and I'm going to lane for the congregation. And again, each of you step up when asked. Each of you do so much. I know that my installation, when it happens, is going to be amazing because 2 of the 3 co-chairs are Stan and Cheryl Hammerman. And, you know, the Pirkei Avot teaches us that we should make for ourselves a teacher and find ourselves a friend. And you found me. You were on the search committee that brought me to this community. And you didn't just find a rabbi, and I didn't just find congregants. I truly found friends in both of you. And I'm so grateful to you, Stan and Cheryl, for all that you do to elevate our community, for all that you do to encourage Jewish learning in the most robust way, for all of the ways in which you dedicate and give of your time, of your resources, of your souls to all of us who are blessed to call you friends. Thank you, Stan and Cheryl. So without further ado, Stan and Cheryl, or Stan is going to introduce our wonderful speaker right now, who I feel awful for having kept turning away to look at the Hammermans, Rabbi Telushkin, who
I was looking at them too.
With good reason.
Yeah. My voice isn't as loud as Rabbi Green's, but I'll raise it a little bit tonight. Thank you so much for your kind words, Rabbi. In your short time here, you've had such a major impact on Cheryl and myself, on the congregation, on the Jewish community. And for those of you who don't know him, you will get to know him because he will be an outstanding member and leader in our Jewish community. I know you will continue to flourish, and we look forward to that. I also want to thank Temple Solel for their hospitality tonight. Temple Solel has been with Valley Beit Midrash from the beginning, and I would be remiss if I didn't thank, I know Rabbi Linder's not here, but I want to thank him for his friendship and his support over the years too. He's really been outstanding. So I'm honored tonight to introduce our scholar, Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, a best-selling author, a speaker, a man who has the innate ability to take Jewish texts and explain how these texts can guide us and make us not just better Jews, but better citizens of the world. And Rabbi Telushkin was educated at Columbia University, at Yeshiva University, probably elsewhere that I don't know about, but he was an active leader in the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. We remember him from way back then. He's led congregations throughout the country. He led Brandeis Bardeen. I personally I've seen you speak probably 3 or 4 times. I attended a couple of meetings, one with the Jewish Federation here where you and Dennis Prager spoke, and then at Bethel where you spoke, and you came for Valley Bay Midrash in 2016. So we're so glad to have you back.
Thank you.
So about 20 years ago, a good friend of mine gave me the book of Jewish values written by you, and he had it signed by you. And I said, Rabbi Telushkin's coming. I'm going to look at that book just to refresh my recollection a little bit. And so I reviewed it, and I'm looking at it, and it's Pesach's coming up. So on Pesach, we asked the 4 questions. In this book, Rabbi, you ask the 4 questions to Jews. What are God's questions to Jews? So I'll just go through that real quickly.
No, don't go through that real quickly. I'm going to be speaking about that.
You want me to go slowly with it? Well, I'm sorry, it just jumped at me, you know.
No, it's a great chapter.
It is.
That's why I want to share it with all of you, but it'll be a little anticlimactic. So I wanted you to know, I'm very moved that you remembered it, and I owe you a debt of gratitude. This is an instance where silence is gold.
Well,
Look
anyway,
at I was paying attention.
I'm going to I'll just make them real concise, because one of the first question.
Oh, please, I know, I'm really serious.
You're only.
No, it's half of my speech.
It's half your speech. I don't want.
Or a third of my speech.
No, I'm not going to.
Okay, thank
I
you.
read it. I studied it.
Okay,
I
good.
enjoyed it, and
And I promise
and
I will
everyone else.
spend time with you at the end of the evening talking about it.
Yeah. Well, we can do that. So I'm not going to go there.
Okay.
But
There are other chapters in the book. Feel free to speak about anything else in the book.
that's pretty amazing that I picked that chapter. But
Right.
anyway, but the one of your last question that God asked the Jewish people was, have you hope for the world's redemption? And that doesn't mean you just hope. That means you do.
Yeah.
And that's what Valley Bay Midrash has been doing for years, with social action, social justice, with bringing in Jewish educators and scholars such as yourself. So, our goal and your goal and what you said in your book is to make the world a better place. And I know that you, through your teachings, have made it a better place.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, that has very rarely ever happened to me. Somebody's introducing me and they're about to say, hey, this is one of the things I learned from Rabbi Telushkin, and now you're going to learn it from me. And Telushkin is going to be very silent. Okay, thank you. No, I'm moved by what you said. Okay, one of the sad things that happened to Jewish life in modernity is that the word religious came to be associated exclusively with ritual observance. So if 2 Jews are speaking about a third, a not uncommon occurrence in Jewish life, and the question is raised, is so-and-so religious? The answer invariably is just based on ritual observance. He keeps Shabbat, he keeps kosher, he is religious, she doesn't keep Shabbat, she doesn't, she's not. From which one could form the very peculiar impression that in Judaism, ethics are an extracurricular activity, a nice thing, but not really that significant. And I think that that's had a very deleterious effect on the perception of Judaism for many Jews. And so I'm going to start, but having just opened up the way I opened up, that so many people put such emphasis on the rituals of Judaism, I want to say something. The rituals are very essential. I'm a ritually observant Jew, and I'll give you 3 reasons why I think rituals are so essential, even though I'm obviously then going to be speaking very much about those other 4 questions. Without rituals, we wouldn't have a sense of holiness. Rituals are really what bring holiness into our lives. I remember many years ago, I was speaking to Abraham Torski, alav shalom. Abraham Torski was a remarkable figure. How many of you have ever read any of his books? He was a psychiatrist, but he also was a Hasidic Rebbe, though he really worked in psychiatry, and he did a lot of work in combating and treating alcoholism. Torski was the youngest of 5 children. It was a family, it was a Hasidic family in Milwaukee, and they had 5 sons, and he was the youngest of the 5 sons. And the parents had a tradition, according to Jewish law, the Sabbath has to be inaugurated with the lighting of how many candles? 2. Not supposed to just light 1, you're supposed to light 2. But did any of you grow up in households, as I did, in which an additional candle was lit for each of the children? Okay, you did, my parents did it. It's just my sister and me, so they lit 4 candles. Torski grew up in a household, and so when he was born, an additional candle was lit because he was the 5th child. And he said, it was very meaningful to me to know that because I existed, every Friday night there was more light in my parents' household. And what Torski, of course, really was referring to was the power of ritual to speak the language of poetry. Obviously, all parents will tell their child how much they love them, but that symbolic act turned out to be very, very meaningful to him. And a lot of the acts, of the sacred acts, how many of you, I'm curious, in Jewish life, there has tended to be a decline in observance. So I'm just curious, in terms of ritual observance, how many of you are basically at the same level of ritual observance as the house in which you grew up? How many of you are more observant than your parents were? Okay, then something. And how many of you are less, or if you don't want to answer, okay. One custom in Judaism, it's not a mandated law, that I think actually is more widely observed today than perhaps in the past, is the blessing of children. In my household, it wasn't done every Shabbat. It was done before the major holidays, particularly before Yom Kippur. But now many people do it on Friday nights. And as some of you probably know, how does the blessing go? What do you say to daughters? You can call it out in English. Yeah, may God make you like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. So then logically, what should the blessing to boys be? Yeah, may God make you like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but it's not. What is it? May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, the real reason for that is because if you look in the Bible, I think it's in Genesis chapter, it's either 48 or 49, I think it's 48. Jacob actually blesses Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And he recites, the very blessing that we still recite. But I once heard, I think it was Shlomo Riskin, I once heard him speaking about it. He said, the other reason is we have reason to believe they actually got along, whereas all the other brothers in the Bible didn't get along. May God make you like Cain and Abel. May God, you can imagine, like Jacob and Esau. But I remember years ago, I read a book. Have any of you familiar with this book? It's called My Grandfather's Blessings by Rachel Naomi Remen. Okay, since only a couple of people are, I would advise you to go on Amazon tonight and look up. It's a beautiful book. Rachel Remen is I'm not sure if she's still with us, but Rachel Remen is a doctor, and she tells in that book, this is just one story. She has it's a very good storyteller, but true stories. I'm not saying she's made up. She grew up in a household that was quite secular and very ambitious. And she said it was the sort of household where if she came home with a 98 on an exam, her father would say, what happened to the other 2 points? Okay, I see some people obviously grew up in similar households. And she said, I spent a good part of my adolescent and later, teenage years pursuing those 2 points. The one place where she didn't feel she was judged like that was in her grandfather's house. On Fridays, she used to go to her grandfather's house after school, and she'd stay there for a couple of hours. And unlike her parents, her grandfather, who I believe was the mother's father, was a pretty pious Jew. And he would give her that blessing. May God make you like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. But he added on something. And ever since I read this in Remen's book, and I read it at the time when my own children were very young, he would add on something she had done that week of which he was proud and of which she could be proud. So when she was very small, that she was able to stay in a room with the lights extinguished, and not be afraid. Later on, something she had done in school that was good, or something she had done that didn't work out well, but she had tried hard. And the great tragedy of her youth was when her grandfather died when she was only 7. And she said, in addition to missing him very, very much, she also was in terror. Who now was going to present her to God? And she says something so beautiful. She said, I learned that when you're blessed, you remain blessed forever. Years later, to Remen's great surprise, her mother, who was then in her 80s and who had always been a pretty secular sort of person, suddenly started lighting Shabbat candles, was drawn to that ritual. And one Friday night, Remen was with her mother and they were talking about it. And she had never told her mother the story of the blessings her grandfather used to give her. And she told her mother, and her mother said something so poignant and beautiful. She said, Rachel, I want you to know that I have blessed you every day of your life. Only unlike your grandfather, I did not have the wisdom to say the blessings out loud. And that's, a very, very important thing. Certainly if people grow up in a household where the parents are very willing to be critical, it'd also be very wonderful if they would say the blessings out loud. So one of the powers of rituals is they introduce holiness into our life. Another power of ritual is continuity. Michael Walzer, the Princeton professor, argued that the story of the Exodus, and he documents it, influenced more movements of social change in history than any other piece of writing. But I believe that if the Jews didn't commemorate that Exodus from Egypt with a Seder every year, the book still would influence a lot of people, but I don't think we as a people would exist any longer. Because the rituals are how we continue it from generation to generation. Unless you're a convert who obviously came to Judaism at a more mature point in your life, everybody else, all the other Jews, basically, they didn't learn about the Seder from books. They learned about it from attending Seders when they were children. And it was interesting, that's where they were encouraged to ask questions. I would love to know if, like Barbara Streisand, probably her first public performance was at the age of 3 or 4, or Bette Midler saying the 4 questions, and that's how they learned about it. And that's how Jews continued. I'm going to ask you a question. Show your hands. You don't have to call it out. How many people here know on what date of the year George Washington was born? Okay, it's all older people. And the reason we all know it, and I'm including myself in that category, so I'm not saying anything that could bother anybody, because when we were growing up, we all knew Lincoln was born on February 12th and Washington was born on February 22nd, and we got off from school. Throughout the United States. In the South, they didn't get off on Lincoln's birthday, but in the rest of the country, they did. By the way, I don't believe in astrology. Is anybody here an astrological fan? Okay, but I want to tell you something that I just once noticed. I didn't see it written anywhere. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12th, 1809. Do you know that on that same date, February, if you know, don't call it out. I want people to maybe see if they can guess it. On that same date, February 12th, 1809, a person I would argue who is as famous as Lincoln, which is not easy, was born on February 12th, 1809. Anybody? Okay, if you know it, call it out. Charles Darwin. Just interesting to have 2 such famous people born on the same day. But younger people don't know it because they ended up doing away with Washington's birthday, and they established the President's Day, which is supposed to honor all presidents, but which in effect really doesn't honor any. Just people get a day off from school and, their store sales. Can you imagine if a group of rabbis got together and said, hey, you know how we could increase attendance at Shul on Yom Kippur? Let's standardize the day. Let's make it the first Sunday in October. Would there be an increase in attendance? I don't think so. I think what would gradually happen is there would be a fall off in attendance, because part of the power of a ritual is that your life has to adjust to the ritual. If the ritual can be dispensed with or modified, so then it no longer has any sense of sanctity about it. I mean, this has led to an odd phenomenon in Jewish life. Do you realize that in over 3,000 years, it has never, ever happened that the Jewish holidays fell on time? The holidays are early this year. The holidays are late this year. So, but that has a lot to do with Jewish continuity. And also, rituals are capable of transmitting ethical lessons. I remember my friend Dennis Prager told me that when he was 6 years old, the first words he learned to read in English were pure vegetable shortening only. He said it was not a terrible thing to learn at the age of 6 that I couldn't have every candy bar in the candy store. No, it was a lesson in self-discipline. But having said that, however, we get back to the issue of what exactly then is the role of ethics in Judaism. And they're very, very central. Wait, I had one point here. What happened is I had cataract surgery a few months ago, and ever since I need to have 2 different pairs of glasses for my reading. And I think I brought the wrong one. Wait, let me see. Okay, now the rest, now for about the next 10 or 12 minutes, I'm going to be quoting your introduction. The very famous story in the Talmud, of course, you know, where a non-Jew comes to Hillel and wants Judaism summarized while standing on one foot. That very same page in the Talmud also has the rabbis discussing what are the first questions we're asked when we die and come before the heavenly court. If you're not familiar with the passage, normally I just say no rabbis are allowed to answer, but now no synagogue leaders here. If you're not familiar with that, what would you guess the rabbi's conjecture is the first question we're asked after we die and come before the heavenly court? If you know it, don't call it out. But so guess what it might be.
How he made a difference.
Okay, believe me, I'm not going to embarrass anybody if they get a wrong guess. You know it though, don't you? Yes. So don't answer. Okay, so somebody take a guess.
How would you make a difference?
Okay, how did you make a difference? What did you do that could make a difference?
Were you good in business?
Wait. Okay, that's an interesting one. Not were you an ethical business person, but were you good in business? Right. Okay, but you knew it.
Oh, no,
You just guessed it?
We did not discuss this.
You did or didn't discuss your introduction? I'm very impressed. You know, I've done this for years and wow. Okay, we'll get to that. Wait, what was the first question? What did you do to make, you know what that reminds me of? A wealthy but extremely stingy man suddenly came before the heavenly court, and it came out that this guy never gave any charity at all, and it was looking very dire for him. But finally, he did remember that once on an extremely cold winter morning, he had gone out and he had seen a poor man without a coat begging, and he'd given the guy a quarter. And he mentions this, and then the booming voice comes from the heavenly court, give the guy his quarter back and tell him to go to hell. The actual question is, this is great. This is an impressive couple over here. I mean, Rabbi Green was saying how impressive they were. Okay, yes, the first question is, nasata v'natata be'emunah. Did you carry out your business affairs honestly? And, you know, one of the books that cites the Talmudic rabbis, obviously the book you most associate with the Talmud is the Gemara itself, but there's also a book, Tosefta, which has other collections of it. And in terms of speaking about honesty, they said there are 2 particularly evil forms of dishonesty, of fraud, and what do you think they might have guessed them to be? I mean, here you don't even have to try and guess what the rabbi said. What would strike you as particularly evil forms of dishonesty? Okay, taking advantage of poor people. I think that would be a good one. Yes, you're right. That's actually a law in the Torah that you have to really make sure your scales are very honest. Yes, that is a law in the Torah. The Tosefta says one is being dishonest in the dealings with non-Jews, because they were very conscious of the fact that how Jews acted towards non-Jews influenced how non-Jews view Jews, but also how they view Judaism. there's a remarkable passage in a book, I think it's an 11th or 12th century work. I'm calling for any of the rabbis here. No, the Smag, the Sefer Mitzvot Gadol. And there's a passage there which is going to shock you. Maybe I shouldn't be so sure, but okay, where it says a Jew should be particularly scrupulous in his business dealings with non-Jews, lest a Jew cheat a non-Jew and try and guess and fill in what the rest is. You know, we would think, you know, unless it causes anti-Semitism or something like that. No, what he actually writes is, lest a Jew cheat a non-Jew and the non-Jew conclude as a result that it's to never think about converting to Judaism, because it obviously is not a religion that produces good people. You know, no one would think that, you know, that Jews at that time were still interested in such a thing. So one is not to be dishonest with non-Jews, and another one is a different form of stealing, though you're right. I think we should also put in the one about particularly cheating poor people, but I'm quoting the passage, so it doesn't really say that. What it does say, Gezel Harabim, somebody who commits fraud against a lot of people. You see, if you cheat another individual, there is the possibility that you will recognize that you did something very wrong, and as a result, repent. You know, you'll pay the money back to the person and you won't act like that again. And that's considered a proper repentance. But if you steal from the many, you know, if you engage, let's say, in some sort of stock market fraud that, you know, drives up the price of a stock based on, you know, not real information, and then you make a lot of money and other people then lose a lot of money, you can't ever really repent, because you're not going to find all the people who were cheated. I remember I once got a letter from, I was doing an ethics advice column. I got a letter from a guy who had been a taxi driver. And apparently for years, he specialized in picking up Japanese tourists. And like 3 or 4 people would get into his taxi. It was before COVID, so sometimes you could have 4 people at a New York taxi. And at the end of the ride, he would point to the meter and said, yes, that's for each of you. And he now realized he had done a terrible thing and he wanted to repent. And I said, there's no real repentance that you can actually do. I encouraged them. I said, maybe develop some sort of charitable thing in Japan. But, you know, you can't always undo. That's why you should always think carefully. I once came across a comment that somebody made. I don't remember who it was. He said, it's easier to repent of sins after we have committed them than to repent before we commit them. You know, if people would realize that if they're going to do something and then they can't undo it. Okay, so that's the first thing about Nasata, that you conduct your business affairs honestly. And also what's interesting is that the rabbis figured that that might be a temptation to many people. I'm not going to say it's a temptation to many Jews, but we know that historically Jews who were convicted of crimes were more likely to be convicted of white-collar crimes than non-Jews. You know, Jews are always prouder of the fact we had less crimes of violence, but when Jews did commit crimes, they usually were white-collar crimes. And it struck me as an interesting thing, because in Hebrew, and I'm not saying that Jews did it in excess of other groups, but we didn't think of ourselves as necessarily being better in that regard than other groups. And it's interesting because in Hebrew, there's no higher appellation than to call a person a chacham, a wise man. Among Sephardic Jews, that's another term for a rabbi. And we know that the term in Hebrew for a scholar is a talmid chacham, one who's a student of the wise. But in Yiddish, the word chacham has a different connotation. Oh, he's a real chacham. You mean somebody who's a trickster. Because people can use their wisdom, you know, and use it in other ways. Okay, the second question the rabbis said that is going to be posed to us, when I get to the fourth, I'll let you speak a little more on it. Now you understand why I got nervous. I'm sitting up here and you're starting this introduction. Kavata itim la Torah. Did you set aside time to study Torah? And this is also an interesting question. If anybody has a good answer to this, I'd love to hear it. I think there's a natural tendency for, how many of you consider yourselves to be passionately political? That you're passionate on political issues? Okay, how many of you who are passionate on political issues generally tend on the liberal side of the issues? Okay, and how many of you are conservatives and passionate? Okay, one hand is raised so cautiously. Okay. What I find generally happens when people are passionate, but this comment is addressed to passionate conservatives and to passionate liberals. I'm not isolating one group because I think it tends to be true. We tend to just try and remember things out of the Jewish writings that support our positions that we already came to. So in a certain sense, one could argue that our religion could be our liberalism or our conservatism, and then we just look for things that reinforce it. So I always like to ask people a question. I don't have a great answer to this myself, but have you ever come across teachings in Judaism that challenge your political views? I mean, and teachings that you have some respect for. I mean, you can always find some odd statements made in Jewish sources that are not so impressive, very extreme. But have any of you come across teachings in Judaism that challenge you? And I think that's a very good thing for people to be on the lookout for, because that's, I think, one of the ways in which we could expand. I mean, I'll give an example here. Okay, given that there are a lot more liberals here than conservatives. If your liberalism, let's say, is rooted in the idea that human beings are inherently good, and if you really look at Jewish sources, there's a lot of skepticism about human nature, which in a sense is the whole rationale for the halachic system. If people really are naturally good and generous, you don't have to have all these laws on the giving of tzedakah and other things. And it's based on a verse early on in the Bible, Lo tov hiyot adam levado. It is not good for men to, no, that's not the verse I wanted. There are advantages in certain ways to being 73. I can't come up with any of them, but I've been told that there are such advantages. You know what happens when you get older? If you're lucky, I mean, unless God forbid you get ill, but your mind becomes like a slow computer. We're so used to computers coming out. I always think in my 20s, moved to Los Angeles and I tried out for Jeopardy. And I got to a certain level where I was considered, but then I didn't get it. And I always thought at the time, by the way, if you're a woman who's very good in general knowledge, because a lot more of the people who got close, were men. But now they should, if they do a Jeopardy show that has older contestants, you have to be a minimum of 60, because I just don't have that same level of speed. And my memory isn't as good, which is why I'm now forgetting why I started telling you this thing about Jeopardy. I forgot the point that I was making. Wait, what was I talking about before I stupidly wandered off?
You were asking.
Oh yeah, about human nature. So it's interesting. If people were naturally good, so you'd walk into a house and you'd hear a mother reprimanding her 3-year-old son, Johnny, stop giving all your toys away to the other children in the neighborhood. Kids have to be taught, to be better, because human beings understandably are born, somewhat selfish. But if you really believe people are naturally good, you're probably going to be more apt to favor value-free education. Because if people are naturally good, just knowing the facts, they're going to choose to do the right thing. But the general tendency in the religious life is you want to teach the values and find ways to implement them. Now, again, you can do it on either side, conservative and liberals. And unfortunately, I think we've reached the stage in America where we no longer look to people who hold different political views and see if there's something we can learn from them. I think one of the things that has led to it is the fact of the internet, which you can only read things that you already agree with. Now, it used to be, you got your news on television, there were 3 networks, and you could hear, more differing views, but now you don't have to. But anyway, you got to set aside time to study Torah. And the rabbis are very insistent of that. The third question is, asakta b'priya ravia, did you try to create a family? Now, again, first of all, not everybody can. Some people, there are issues that come up and they can't have children. but the goal and the ideal was that people, and if, you know, and if people tell me they really don't want to have children, I do not try and convince them, because I think people should only have children if they really want to have children. Otherwise, you know, because raising children, we all know, has its own challenges and its own heartaches, and it has its own wonderful things. But the goal was to transmit certain values from generation to generation. And that can only happen if Jews are replacing and more than replacing themselves. Now, in almost all secular societies, people are having fewer and fewer children. I mean, there's been a lot written about this in relation to Europe, where people are not really replacing themselves. Interestingly, the only country I know in which secular people have, on the average, 3 children is Israel. It's very interesting that secular Israelis in that regard, now obviously in the Orthodox and what we call the ultra-Orthodox world, people often have very large families. I have a friend, my only really close friend in the Haredi world, who has 18 children. Now, and from one wife. In part, it came about because there was a real tendency towards multiple births. I think there were 3 sets of twins, and I think one, or certainly at least one set of triplets within the family. But leaving that aside, even secular Israelis tend to have it because there's a real love of and appreciation of children. And so the rabbis want that. They want people to replace themselves. There's an argument in the Talmud. Everybody's in agreement that people, if it's within their capacity, should have at least 2 children. Shammai says you have to have at least 2 male sons. Doesn't sound to me like that could lead to its own problems. You know, Hillel says you have to have a child of each sex, which, you know, is not, again, within everybody's power. And we know the problems it could lead to, because remember, there was a policy in China for many years of only allowing people to have 1 child. And in a society like that, where people are only allowed to have 1 child, there was a greater preference for males. And in the age range, I think of now between like 35 and 55, there are like 20 million more men than women. You know, where it raises an interesting issue in a society that restricts people to only having 1 child. Should abortion be restricted? You know, it's a very weird thing, because the reason for the abortion in that child is a very anti-feminist reason. They were doing it because if they could only have 1 child, they didn't want to have a girl. You know, so it's an oddity, but the idea was they wanted the perpetuation. Okay, so what we notice here is the first 3 questions are all micro. These are all personal issues. Did you personally act honestly in business? Did you personally study Torah? Did you personally try and create a family? The 4th question, which is,
Redemption.
yeah, did you hope for the world's redemption? Tzipita liyeshua. Did you be? And what that I think points out is we're supposed to first work on ourselves, but the point of working on ourselves is then to work on the whole world. You know, you want children growing up loving their family, in the hope that that will also lead them to being, you know, more loving sorts of people. So tzipita liyeshua. And like Eddie was telling me when he picked me up today, I'm sorry that Shmuley had to walk out for something, because I want to say something very nice about him. I mean, it's not that.
It's recorded.
Oh, okay, it's being recorded. Okay, you know, he established the standard in Kashrut of also insisting on the ethical treatment of employees in the process of Kashrut. Because again, you know, with what I was saying earlier about people tended to get obsessed with rituals. So they were obsessed that were all the rituals of Kashrut carried out properly. And some of them have an ethical upshot, some don't. One that has an ethical upshot is that the knife that the slaughterer has to use has to be a very sharp knife, no way blunted, so that the animal can be killed as quickly as possible. You know, but there are animals that, for example, I don't think veal should be regarded as kosher, because the animals are terribly mistreated from a very, very young age in order to produce this very tender meat. And it's always bothered me, that that's allowed to be kosher. And then Shmuley, to his great credit, and Eddie was telling me more about this, also said, what about the way the workers are treated? So you can go into a butcher shop or a restaurant and people are being paid, let's say they're here. Oh, Shmuley, you're coming back. I've been speaking very nicely about you for the last few minutes. I was speaking about the fourth question of Tzipita Yeshua, and you're creating a stand. And I said the first three questions are micro questions. Were you personally honest in business? Did you personally study Torah? Did you personally try and create a family? But did you hope for the world's redemption? And I was talking about what you've done by establishing a new standard of Kashrut and I know that the caterer whose food we're eating tonight is specifically because he fulfills those standards. He's a Yemenite Jew, right? Is that the one that we're doing tonight? But do you realize how everything gets elevated when you think in those terms? So the goal of the micro is obviously to make us pleasant, ethical people in our personal lives, but it's also because we then really can contribute something to the world. And we have, so Tzipita Yeshua then becomes like the culminating factor. Now, I mentioned earlier that on the same page of the Talmud is that famous story about Hillel and the non-Jew. Anybody who knows that story, and it can't be rabbis, and now there's at least one layperson who can't answer. Anybody how many of you are basically familiar with the story where Hillel explains Judaism to a non-Jew while standing on one foot? Okay. Tell me the story as you know it. And believe me, if somebody makes any errors, I think you can sense I'm not the sort of person who's going to start humiliating anybody. But there's a common misconception about that story, and I want to see. So anybody who knows the story, okay, great. It's a very accurate answer. But what was the question? What was the question the non-Jew posed to Hillel? Okay, so as you replied, can you teach me the essence of Torah while I'm standing on one foot? To which Hillel replies, Da'alech Hasani, what's hateful unto you, don't do unto your neighbor. This is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Zeal, Gemara, now go and study. Now, I think that if we see, for example, a rabbi in dialogue with a minister, a Protestant minister or a Catholic priest, and a Muslim imam, we would more or less sense that that would be a comfortable answer for all of them, or anything that would emphasize the ethical. But the actual question, because people rarely look up the story in the Talmud, the actual question the non-Jew said to Hillel was, Gayareni almanat, convert me to Judaism on condition that you can teach me the Torah while I'm standing on one foot. And it was answered in response to that question, can you convert me to Judaism, that Hillel starts with that ethical principle and then converts the man. Now, obviously, Hillel was acting in a very optimistic way. Maybe he was assuming if the man was being converted in the context of a Jewish society, he's going to continue learning and he'll learn more. I was once at an event in which Adin Steinsaltz, one of the great Talmidei Chachamim, great scholars, a man who actually translated the Talmud in its entirety with commentary from Aramaic into Hebrew. I mean, Aramaic and Hebrew have a lot of similarities, but believe me, just knowing Hebrew does not make it easy to study the Talmud. And I was one of three people who was honored be asked to ask Steinsaltz a question. And Adin Steinsaltz, who, alav hashalom, was a wonderful scholar, but also could sometimes be a little sharp. I asked him a question and got him really angry at me. I said, doesn't that story about Hillel answering the guy who wants to convert indicate that we should become much more liberal in our accepting of converts? And Steinsaltz got really irritated. I won't quote exactly what he said because it could end up sounding offensive. But but he said nobody would have a standard like that today. What do you think? But all I naively tried to defend myself was saying, I'm just quoting the Talmud. But it obviously meant that there was a greater openness, and it shows the centrality of the ethical to Hillel. Because the guy says, convert me to Judaism, and he starts with the ethical. And why, I think, does he do that? I think because he wanted to establish a common language with the person. If you start only with things, how did it come about that such emphasis got placed on the ritual? I think a lot of the rabbis were so fearful of assimilation that they wanted to emphasize that which made Jews different from everybody else. And the ethics, in some ways we could have in common with others. And I think they, to some extent, underplayed it. I remember I once heard a rabbi for whom Rabbi Shmuley and I have the greatest of admiration, Yitz Greenberg. I have a number of words of wisdom of Yitz that I've popularized. One of them was, I don't care what denomination in Judaism you belong to, as long as you're ashamed of it. Less well known is another statement of Yitz's. He said, if we Jews are 5% better than the rest of the world, we can be an oral agoyim, a light unto the nations. If we're 25% better than the rest of the world, we can bring the Messiah. If we're 50% better than the rest of the world, we'll be dead. Because you have to live in a world where you have to be able to really defend yourself and to do so. And okay, now I've done the terrible thing again. What was I talking about? Because obviously it was something that Yitz said that I was thinking of. Okay, Shmuley, I know what a disciple you are of Yitz Greenberg. So did you ever hear Yitz make this comment? When I went to YU, I majored in history, which meant I majored in Yitz Greenberg, because he was the head of the history department at YU. And it was very funny because he had gotten his PhD in US history from Harvard. And then he started offering among the first courses ever offered at the college level on the Holocaust. He had classes that dealt with Musar. And the dean of the school said, we brought you from Harvard because we want to show what a great college we are and that we have a Harvard PhD teaching American history. They didn't bring him in to be a Jewish historian, but that's where Yitz's thinking was taking him. Oh, so Yitz once, in speaking about 19th century Reform Judaism, said, versus the Chasam Sofer, who was an exponent of right-wing Orthodox Judaism, Kol Chadash Asur min Torah, anything new is forbidden by the Torah. It's a complicated issue, but it was a pun that he was making. He said, the Orthodox made the right error, but it was an error by putting their central emphasis on the ritual. Because he said the Reform were putting that emphasis on the ethical, and it led to tremendous numbers of them ending up converting to Christianity and believing it to be more ethical, or believing that they didn't want, as Heine put it, it's your entrance ticket to civilization, and believing, okay, so there's enough in Jesus that we could appropriate. Yeah, of course you could feel, because Jesus was, of course, also Jewish. So that's the point. But so that's why I started with the importance of ritual. But we got to get back to the centrality of the ethical. But I'm going to conclude. Okay, I'll conclude with one final thought. When Jesus was asked to summarize his teachings, I think it's in the Gospel of Matthew, but it might be in more than one gospel. He cites two teachings. Does anybody know what they are? He cites love your neighbor as yourself and love the Lord your God. So he cites two biblical verses. 100 years later, Akiva says, love your neighbor as yourself. This is a principle, or this is a major principle, or the major principle of the Torah. Hillel lived before both of them. From what we can ascertain, we don't have the precise data, but it would seem that Hillel probably died around 10 BCE. So why do you think Hillel didn't, unlike Jesus, who cited love your neighbor as yourself, and Akiva, who cited that, what do you think might be the reason he came up with a negative formulation? What's hateful unto you, don't do unto your neighbor. The rest is commentary. I'm really throwing it out because there's no definitive answer. I have a thought, but there's no definitive answer to that. But why do you think he did it? Yes. Okay, I think it's pretty close to what my formulation is going to be. What you're saying, love is too broad, and it really is too broad. I mean, do you know that, God forbid you read about abusive parents, and there are abusive parents who actually claim that they love their children? And, and if you can love somebody and be abusive, then the word love obviously is emptied of all meaning, you know. So, but what I think Hillel was doing is love your neighbor as yourself had the unfortunate fate of becoming a cliche. You know, think about it. When you're reading a novel and on every page there's a cliched expression, you're probably going to put the book down. But if you think about it, every cliche was originally an original insight. That's why it became a cliche. People like to quote it. But then once it became a cliche, so I think that was the fate of love your neighbor as yourself. So I think that if Hillel had said to the guy, yes, and the essence of Judaism is love your neighbor as yourself, I think the guy would have thanked Hillel, walked out of his office or whatever he had, his study hall, and immediately forgotten it. And I'll tell you why I say that. I would guess every single person in this room probably heard that teaching, love your neighbor as yourself, before the age of 10. How many of you, I'm now asking a different question, how many of you in the last month, when you had to decide how to act in an ethical situation, how many of you in reaching your conclusion thought of the verse, love your neighbor as yourself, and how it would apply to this? Okay, no hands are going up. Usually I get one or two, but because it became a cliche. But Hillel's formulation, as you were also maintaining, also was a fresh way of formulating it. If everybody here for the next 24 hours really thought before they took any action of what's hateful unto you, don't do unto your neighbor, let's say for the next week, because it might not come up in a 24-hour period, I think that would actually affect our behavior more. And so that's what I think Hillel was trying to do. So what I'm trying to do in my work, because I am a pretty religiously observant Jew, but I want to look also, number one, for what I think was Judaism's contribution. People often say Judaism's contribution was monotheism. But monotheism in and of itself is just an arithmetic reduction of the number of gods, from many gods to one god. I think Judaism's contribution was ethical monotheism. You know, people can believe in God, but the God that they believe in could demand of them to do very unethical things. So I think ethical monotheism was the great Jewish contribution. I think it's important that Jewish thinkers think in those terms. I also think it has the capacity to bring many more Jews to think enthusiastically about Judaism in their lives. And I think it would make an impression on the broader world in which we live. And that's the thought I want to leave you with. Thank you very much.
Okay, amazing, amazing. Thank you so much. So before we get to questions from our Zoom friends and questions from folks here, I'll kick us off a little bit.
Okay.
So as you know well, and as to remind friends, there are in moral philosophy, there's three primary kind of camps of frameworks of how we think of moral dilemmas. We have deontology, so we think about rules and duties and obligations. Then we have consequentialism or utilitarianism, you think about the outcomes. And then we have virtue ethics, where we think about the virtues we bring. So I wonder if you think any of those three are more dominantly Jewish in our, and more authentically Jewish in our tradition. And to play out one case today, so if you know the famous trolley case, you're on a trolley, and if you are passively going straight, you'll kill 5 people. And if you actively shift tracks, you will actively kill 1. So the deontologist says, well, of course you have to keep going straight. I don't care how many are killed, you can't actively kill someone. And the consequentialist says, no, of course it's less bad to kill 1 than 5. So to apply that to Russia today, from a Jewish ethics framework, from a principled perspective, of course you got to fight the bully. Right? You got to fight the bully. And from a utilitarian perspective, more people die if you fight the bully, so you stop fighting. So I wonder, so I mean, do you think any of those three are more authentically Jewish, and how would you apply that to that foreign policy crisis today?
I think the second question is in a sense more interesting, because it's always when you're forced to actually apply it to something that it comes out. So I assume what you mean is that if we respond to Russia very aggressively, we risk having a nuclear war. Which is why, by the way, it's a very interesting thing, why the desire to not see nuclear arms proliferate, and now it's probably too late, is so dangerous. I'll just give you one example. Devorah, my wife, and I were actually in India one of our daughters at the time was a follower of Amma. Any of you know Amma, the hugging saint? Okay, and she's not at this point a follower of Amma, but I've been hugged by Amma. It's considered a big honor because she always gave me an apple. But at that same trip, we spent a week on Amma's, I was going to say on Amma's kibbutz, on Amma's ashram. And then we brought Rebecca with us to the Chabad house in Mumbai. And the couple we stayed with were the very couple who 6 months later were murdered. And my friend Dory Gold, who we'd been roommates at Columbia, and Dory.
At the bite?
Yes,
Yeah,
they were
okay.
roommates in the bite. And Dory went on to have, he was the director general of the foreign ministry. And he told me after that event, because remember, it was obviously not only the Chabad couple who were killed, those terrorists had gone into like the fanciest hotel in Mumbai, and many, many people were killed. And a high-level Israeli general was meeting with high-level Indian generals. And he said, but you knew where the terrorists' place was, their central place. Why didn't you bomb it? And he said, the government forbade us because Pakistan has nuclear weapons. It also made me think about something else. So what should we do with Russia, with all the sanctions and other things, and what we're doing? And we got very angry, what should Russian Jews do? And some of the Russian Jews have aligned themselves with Putin because they're afraid. And a lot of us are very angry at the Germans from the 1930s for I'm not talking about the Germans who joined the SS. I mean, obviously, that's just total wickedness. But the average German was probably just very scared to do anything. And it just made me just think about that. I suppose everything you have to take into account, some of it, the ontological, what the law would say, but then you see, because even when you get to the practical impact, if it unleashed a war, so then if it unleashed an atomic war and millions of people died, would that necessarily represent a more moral solution? So it's very often hard, really, to define morality. I think you can all recognize that he asked me a very, very good question, and I'm giving a very stumbling answer. Does anybody have a better answer than I as to what do you think would be the morally appropriate response for America to do? I'm assuming at the moment that there are probably very few or no people here who have a warm regard for Putin. Putin, by the way, is an interesting phenomenon to me because in general, I find that people who are anti-Semites are terrible people in many ways. Many people suffer as a result of it. Putin is a rare phenomenon where he actually is not an anti-Semite. He has certainly not been bad to the Jews. And he's told the Chabad rabbi in Moscow that it had to do with the fact that when he was a kid, he was very poor and there was a religious Jewish family that used to give him food. And also there was a Jewish woman who was a teacher of his. And when he visited Israel, he actually went to this woman's house. I think he even bought her a house. So, these are heartwarming stories, but, this is a level of evil that's hard to fathom. So does anybody have something other than what the United States has done? Does anybody have any different thoughts on what the United States should have done? What you think would have been the morally appropriate thing? Okay, so I think we're all in agreement, but the question is.
The bystander.
Yes. Oh, wait, so I missed. What was the point then?
Oh, yeah. So she's saying the right of self-defense, the obligation of self-defense. And our dilemma is the third part, not the.
Yeah, I actually don't think it's so bad. What Lindsey Graham is saying, that we should back anybody who wants to assassinate Putin. It's interesting. He got jumped on by two people on the far left and on the far right of the Democratic Party. Ilhan Omar sharply criticized him. And what's that woman's name? Green? Having nothing to do with it. Yes, you would know the name. No, so I thought.
It's spelled the same way.
No, so I thought it was interesting to my mind that, because what he said, I think, was utterly appropriate. Halavai, that imagine somebody had assassinated Hitler in 1937. And my reasoning is this: no Hitler, no Holocaust. I don't think any other Russian leader would have initiated and done what Putin did. So if there was no Putin, it wouldn't happen. And it's a good chance, even if he was killed, now it might stop it. But does anybody have any other thoughts about what the United States, let's say, should do? Because we all, most of us grew up having a certain amount of anger, and there was some real basis for it, because by the summer of 1944, the Allies had unchallenged air superiority over Germany, so they really could have bombed the railroad tracks and other things. But here, you're right, Putin is just crazy enough to use the atom bomb. If he thought he was going to lose, so he would say, like Samson, let me die with the Philistines, let them die. The only, I don't have that many friends who are big Trump supporters, but their argument, they keep saying, Putin wouldn't have done it with Trump because he thinks Trump is so crazy, who knows how he'll respond. But does anybody have any other thoughts on what the United States should do morally? Yes.
So just to repeat for Zoom, because we're getting some feedback that morality, Andy is suggesting, has to be tempered with pragmatism.
Yeah, right. And sometimes it's very unlucky, like for the Ukrainians.
Okay,
but
we're going to move to our next question. I'm sorry for the folks on Zoom who can't hear the comments. So let's hear from another question here. Yes, David. Okay, apologies to our Zoom friends. That's really hard to recapture. David asks, well, isn't part of the moral calculation how the Russian population is treated with sanctions? And he argues that would be morally appropriate. And I think that's a question for you as well.
Yeah, because otherwise, Putin could just go on doing whatever he wants. I mean, in the case of Nazi Germany, it was a little easier because Hitler had come into power through an election. Now, the truth is he didn't get a majority of the vote, but he manipulated things. But there were a lot of Germans who supported him. And in his early years, as he was doing very well, more and more did. We have no idea really what the Soviet citizens are thinking. But if we held off putting any pressure on them, what would happen? Okay, let me ask a question. I'm just curious. Based on what we now know, how many of you think in retrospect, Truman made the right decision in dropping an atom bomb on Hiroshima? And how many of you think it was the wrong decision? Okay, now his calculation was that it was estimated that 500,000 to 1 million American troops would be killed in the effort to end the war. And obviously a lot of Japanese, would also be killed. But you could really see the arguments on both sides. Strangely enough, I'm going to tell you something. There's an amazing book. Go and get it on Amazon. This book was written 20 years ago by a man named Jonathan Glover. Glover is a professor of, I don't know if he still is, but he's a professor of philosophy at Cambridge. And he wrote a book called Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century. And he starts the book with the assumption that philosophy will become utterly irrelevant if it takes no cognizance of history. And he shows many, many terrible things that have happened in the 20th century. And in it, he reveals, I think it's there that I read it, a detail I'd never heard of. Eisenhower had actually opposed dropping the atom bomb. Eisenhower said, this is a terrible weapon, and I don't want the United States to be, the first country who does it. I happen to have agreed with what Truman did, but, there are certain, in life, we don't always have a choice between good and bad. Sometimes we have a choice between horrible and less horrible. By the way, I want to just say one other comment about Eisenhower, because I grew up in a typical, pretty liberal Jewish household, which loved Adlai Stevenson, because Adlai Stevenson was incredibly bright. He was funny. In the 1960 election, when Norman Vincent Peale, a very popular, man known for the power of positive thinking, came out against Kennedy because he was a Catholic. So Stevenson, with his great wit, said, I find Peale appalling and Paul appealing. And he was known for coming up with things like that. And Eisenhower, I think among most Jews, was thought of as pretty much of an intellectual lightweight. So I want to tell you something that I came across when Eisenhower liberated the first concentration camp that was liberated by the Americans. Eisenhower went in and said, and did a very detailed inspection of it. He said Patton wouldn't go in. Patton was afraid he'd throw up. He would, get so sick of it. sick of it. Eisenhower in April 1945 writes to Marshall, who, the head of the army. He said, I made an inspection so that I could be in a position, should there arise a movement in the future to deny the Holocaust. He didn't call the Holocaust because it wasn't called that. To deny the truth of these things, I want to be able to show that I saw it with my own eyes, which was very far-seeing. There's that teaching, Ezu Chacham Haroeh Tanolad, one who can foresee the consequences, of his actions. So it just, I was just very impressed with that because it's not how I was raised to think about Eisenhower. Yes, no, that's an important point, but it goes back to what you were saying, David. To what extent do citizens bear responsibility if their government does very evil acts? But if we free them from any responsibility, then there's nothing to inhibit their governments, from doing very unethical acts. But you're right, with your deontological and others.
Yeah.
No, it raises a very interesting question. To what extent are citizens responsible for actions carried out? Which is why, by the way, you can argue that in a democracy, people have more moral responsibility because they have the ability to vote in a government or vote out of government.
Great. So we have three questions I see here. Rabbi Nitzan Stein-Koken, yes?
Repeat the last words. How can Judaism make a difference?
Great. Great. So Rabbi Nitzan Stein-Koken's question here is, how can Judaism help us to live a better life, engage more civically? Actually, Rabbi Telushkin is finishing a book on this topic now. So.
Yes. What I'd want to say is Jews have made extraordinary contributions to American life. I mean, if you start thinking of all the areas in which Jews have made amazing contributions, but they generally have not made it as Jews. Jews have very rarely have made it in the name of Judaism. That's why years ago, never really went anywhere, but I was able to get two senators, one of whom you're not surprised to learn was Joe Lieberman, and the other was a Republican, Connie Mack. I wanted it to be a bilateral thing, to establish a national Speak No Evil Day in the United States based on the laws of Lashon Hara. I wanted Jews to contribute something to American society and to do it as Jews. So I think it becomes important that people use values drawn from Judaism and make it known that they're drawn from Judaism. And obviously, we're appealing to other people as well. I mean, that's how I think can do it. Also, if it got attention in the media, there are a lot of Jews who don't show up in synagogue. There are a lot of Jews who, if the media was suddenly taking a Jewish idea seriously, they would be exposed to it in a way they otherwise wouldn't be. Okay.
Okay, great. So yeah, Pat, let's hold that as a question for our dessert that everyone can return to, because it's an awesome question, and I want to keep going. Yes, Nick. Yes, Nick.
It'll be fun while we're having dessert.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, have a good time. Yeah, Nick. Great. So just sorry, friends in the room. I know the hybrid's kind of complicated. Patricia asked, what if Putin then goes into Poland? Like what will the red line be? And she's really disturbed about this moment. And we're going to have that as a fun conversation at dessert. And then Nicholas Hummel says, how can we teach Jewish law better so that young Jews want to be immersed and in love with the most traditional side of our Torah?
Well, one thing, people want to enjoy life. And if halacha is presented to people as being very restrictive, it's not going to work. I spent 5 years of my life researching and writing a book about Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And I'll tell you an interesting thing about Chabad. It's the only major movement in Jewish life that has never put particular emphasis on the Holocaust. And I think he intuited something, which there's no question that I was born in 1948. So there's no question that in the aftermath of the Holocaust, this was probably that and the creation of Israel were the two most significant events that happened. But by the time you get to the third and fourth generation, the Holocaust, despite what you think, is only going to attract people to Judaism if they're convinced that nothing like that will ever happen again. The Holocaust could as much motivate people to want to assimilate. The Nazis were unique in the history of anti-Semites in that they traced back 4 generations to find out if you were Jewish. But I think if you really think what Chabad did was they always put their emphasis on joyful things, on parties, on Shabbat, making it a very joyful occasion. Limud Torah even, was done in a joyful way, making a big deal out of, Purim and the other holidays. They would give it Jewish content, but they emphasized the joy of it. And I think that's what we have to do, because otherwise people tend to think of religion as being more restrictive. Now, they also didn't go so far in just emphasizing the joy that they stripped it of all, of all content. So, and I say it only listen, I was growing up in the 1950s. My grandfather, who was a pretty prominent Orthodox sage, had a shul that we would go to. And I used to see Chabad Chassidim. They would come to that shul on Simchas Torah and dance. And believe me, I never thought this movement had any future in America. I'd see these young men with beards, acting nicely and acting very, joyfully, but it seemed so at variance. And yet they did something. And I think it's because they exemplified a certain joy in it. When I was working on the book, Deborah would say to me, "You were at 770 today. That's the headquarters of Chabad, weren't you?" And I said, "Why do you say that?" She said, "Because you're in a good mood." And Chabadniks are very optimistic. And they are. Look, and they've had losses. I mean, they've had, terrible losses. And it's not, and the Rebbe, once in response to a question where an enormous amount of money, a cousin of his was involved in directing a very large amount of money to be used to build a Holocaust memorial in France. And the Rebbe said, I think if you really want to do honor to the Jews who died there, I wouldn't do it for a Holocaust memorial. I would do it to try and ensure that the next generation of Jews remain Jewish. And, it is an interesting thing, because in Jewish studies departments, the percentage of courses on the Holocaust probably is a very significant percentage. And I'm not sure what it ends up, I don't want to see the Holocaust, God forbid, in any way minimized. It's an interesting phenomenon to account for what accounts for Chabad's expansion.
Great. Let's take one more question if we have one. Yes, please.
I unfortunately.
Yeah. Can you, if you could state the question part one more time?
No, I'll tell you, in order to do it, could you please sit here? You have a beautiful,
Yeah.
But your voice was too gentle.
Okay, just to catch folks up. So there's a young woman here who's saying she's converting, and she's comparing some of what she learned in Christianity to Judaism.
Oh, good.
Yes.
It's an interesting question. No, there really is an insufficient amount in the Jewish literature on disabilities. I think it was also in the more general literature as well. I mean, the worst thing was disabilities. This is terrible what I'm going to say, but disabilities were often viewed as like a punishment from God. And, if somebody was depicted, let's say, as only having 2 fingers or something, usually it turned out he was a bad person, and the whole idea that bad people are often ugly people, or afflicted. So I think there has been a movement in Judaism for recognition of a greater recognition that a variety of different types of impairments are very, very common. But you're right, I don't think it's true. You're right. Jesus is depicted as curing blind people who had faith in him. But I don't know. You know what? You asked a good question, and I have not thought it through enough.
Well, to bring some of our last VBM classes into the conversation as well, we had a disability scholar from Georgetown who recently spoke at VBM, and she argued a minority viewpoint in disability scholarship around that we should talk about care, not cure, and that it's offensive in the disabilities community to talk about cure. And yet Isaiah's prophecy is actually that disabilities will be cured. And so Yitz Greenberg, bring him back in, argued against that minority viewpoint, that actually the Jewish prophetic and messianic vision is for the curing ultimately of disabilities, although there's a growing trend that he acknowledges in disability studies to honor disabilities as a value as opposed to something to be cured. So that we can discuss at dessert as well. So we have some closing words from Cheryl Hammerman, and then the final words from Rabbi Steele, and then we welcome you to the courtyard for dessert, which is already set up out there. So.
I first and foremost want to thank you all for coming and for continuing to support Valley Bay Midrash, which has been just a wonderful program and amazing growth, Jewish growth and learning for our community. Rabbi Telushkin, thank you. You've made your incredible learning. You've helped us with your teaching. You've helped us to learn even more, and it's been a pleasure to listen to you as always, as we've heard you much before. Rabbi Steele and Temple Solel, thank you so much again for hosting us. Rabbi Green, for your very, very kind words. And Shmuley, what can I say? Thank you for doing all of this. And we are very appreciative and hopeful, Janice, for your work.
Honor it has been to have you on this bima. Thank you so
Oh my
much
God,
for
thank you.
your words. And for anybody who doesn't know, if you want a 1-volume book that has depth and it's so accessible on Jewish literacy, biblical literacy, and Jewish ethics, Jewish humor, Rabbi Telushkin's books are the place to go. And
That's
it
so
doesn't,
kind. Thank you.
I really believe that it doesn't matter if you're Reformed, Conservative, or Orthodox, you make your books accessible and meaningful to all. So really appreciate that
Good.
so very much.
Thank you.
And for us at Solel, this is the first community event that we've had since COVID. So I would love it if we would get Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'hidyanu l'zman hazeh. Amen.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Yeah, thank you so much. Good.